Good afternoon, or morning, or evening. Oh, probably should turn the mic. Yes, mic is there now. Amazing. Hopefully, the mic is set in a good volume, by the way. I should have checked that. I think I'm checking it right now, by the way. Hope you can't see that, but maybe you can see that. It'd be kind of more interesting. Volume, I guess it's okay. Seems okay. Brightness, that's good. That's good to know. The brightness is good. Thank you guys. Anyway, not legal advice, of course. I'm looking at the volume this time. Not legal advice. Please like, subscribe, share, comment, um, comment or don't comment, whatever you'd like. Now I think I probably could be even heard. Hi, Lee. Hi, Darren. Hi, Mr. StreamYard. How y'all doing? Oh, Glastonbury, right? That's where the music festival is, right? That they just had. Hey, AC, Donna, Deborah, Big Vic. How you doing there? Bogey one, Bogey Golf. Thank you for clarifying again. I appreciate that. Yeah, so I thought about the recent Supreme Court ruling about the universal injunctions that everybody thought was a huge ruling. I figured since apparently everybody thought it was a huge ruling that I could talk about a little bit, maybe put it in a better context. So we'll see what it actually does. This doesn't relate to, or at least not currently relate to, the other matters I talk about. But anyway, I thought this was an interesting topic. It was the recent case, which I have in front of me. It's like a 115-page opinion. Who's going to read that? That's like one of those bills in Congress. I think they're talking about it now. The Trump bill, the tax cut, etc. I think one of the strategies that Democrats are going to force everybody to actually read it, which is the irony of it, because nobody ever reads any bills in Congress because it's not possible to read those bills. They're so long, kind of ridiculous. But anyway, I'm going to talk about the Supreme Court case, which was ironically titled Trump versus Casa Inc., which involved three different lawsuits that were kind of combined. And I'll get into it in a second. And the question is how many people are going to be impacted by that, etc. And want to talk about temporary restraining orders, preliminary injunctions anyway, just kind of talk about what happened here. But with a capital B, before I started, I wanted to go over a few quick things. Hi, Jay's son. Hello. A few things. Did you know that 42.7365% of statistics are made up on the spot? Also, that change is inevitable, except when it comes to vending machines. And, I'm sure you've all heard this said before, but can't be said enough, that a day without sunshine is like night. And last but not least, 99% of lawyers give the other lawyers a bad name. So welcome. Wanted to talk about this case a little bit. So let's put it in perspective. The Supreme Court, hi, Born Free Films, by the way. The Supreme Court just ruled on this matter. What did they rule on? It was a partial injunction. So this case involves the birthright citizenship. A universal injunction was issued by district court. The government appealed that and appealed the partial stay in effect. So there was a stay in effect. The plaintiffs got an injunction stopping them from being sent out of the country. The court interpreted that injunction to apply to every person in the country that was in the same position as the plaintiffs. The Supreme Court wanted to limit that decision to just the named plaintiffs And that's really what is involved. And so what is an injunction? So we have the case. The case itself goes on, by the way. And the case is that the claim is the practice is unconstitutional. So notwithstanding, that's one of those legal terms that people like to use. What happens with regard to the injunction? The case goes forward. And ultimately, and I think I heard they expect it in the next term, ultimately the Supreme Court will issue a decision on the issue of whether birthright citizenship can be altered, amended, or canceled. That's going to happen. That won't happen probably till the next term, which begins in October. It might be early in the term. Maybe they, are close to a decision already, but that's going to go forward. The injunction is, and the reason why it was appealed, the injunction that was obtained by the plaintiffs, those are the people that had filed the claim, is they were trying to block anybody from being sent out of the country until the end of the case. So they filed the action. Now, the court talks about this and basically says, we're not deciding the birthright citizenship order, but we're going to kind of look to see if universal injunctions, in other words, if I went into court and I won, I could get an order affecting the entire country, whether that was really something that was intended by either the founding fathers or is consistent with the law. And what they usually look back is back in Old England and how they did it, and they kind of looked at that as kind of a base. We kind of have two different things here. So courts do two different things. They do a lot more than two things, but when they're examining like disputes, one is like a question of law or dispute in law where money damages are sought. And that's like, for example, somebody has a contract with somebody else. One of them breaches the contract, causes one of the parties to actually lose money, and they go to court and they try to recoup that money. And that would be like an action in law. There's also other actions, and that's what this particular case involved, and that's called actions in equity. So it's not for monetary damages, could be for injunction, could be for a declaratory relief, or it could be, something like for cancellation of an instrument, for example. And I'm not talking about a tuba or a trombone, but I have an ongoing case, and it involves a piece of property that a church in the inner city of LA owns. And about 15 years after some loan was recorded against the property, a dispute arose, I got involved, whatever. 15 years was a long time after the fact. And what we were seeking was to cancel, get rid of a lien. And that's some kind of, when somebody has a mortgage, for example, they record a document against the property that creates a lien. So in this case, there was some type of transaction that created the lien. We wanted to cancel that. So that was not an action at law. That was an action in equity, which is kind of what we're talking about in the instant Trump case. And in my case, the way it goes, and to explain this, so the underlying case was that, but as it turned out, during the case, the bad guys, I'm going to say in this case, they started a foreclosure proceeding against the church. So during the case, even though it wasn't the primary relief that I was seeking, I had to get an injunction in the middle of the case to stop the foreclosure. And the way an injunction goes, first of all, you have a temporary restraining, generally how it goes. First, you would get a temporary restraining order. That's just to kind of keep the status quo, and it's for short term. Then you would get and then if that was granted to stop whatever you wanted to stop, then they would go to a temporary restraining order. A preliminary injunction. A preliminary injunction would last the entirety of the case until the end. Theoretically, at the end of the case, you would have a trial, and that would determine whether a permanent injunction would go into place. But whereas a temporary restraining order is just to kind of keep things kind of static, a preliminary injunction, the court has already decided that the party that's seeking the injunction is likely to prevail in the case. That doesn't mean it's etched in stone. That doesn't mean it can't change. But the court has made a preliminary finding that one party is likely to win or not. And they need that in order to provide that relief, the injunction. So in this case, this case involves a universal injunction, and the court talks about the standard of entering an injunction. And what they do is basically they looked at the Judiciary Act and how England conducted themselves to see if this was the type of matter that the courts in England would accept as providing this kind of remedy. In other words, they looked at to see in England, would they grant universal injunctions? Was there such a thing? And they also go historically in the 18th, 19th century, and even in the United States, very few universal injunctions. That's increased over time, to the current time. But part of that is because the current time, there's also more executive orders, and that's the kind of a bigger issue. So, obviously the legislature is supposed to legislate when executive orders are issued, whether they be rightfully or wrongfully. The question is that taking away power from the legislature that exists with the legislature? And does that make it an unconstitutional action? We haven't really got to that. There's no real cases that are challenging it. The Supreme Court's not going to look at that, but perhaps future Supreme courts will. So here we are in this case. We're just talking about the injunction. That's all we're talking about, because there was no decision on the merits. And again, the underlying claim was that the executive order violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, the Citizenship Clause, and Section 201 of the Nationality Act of 1940. That's what the claim is. And the court says specifically, we're not deciding that. But the court looked at, in England, would they grant these universal injunctions? And they could not find, if somebody is inclined, this is my view, if someone's inclined to find it in a particular way, they could find something to support their decision. So I can't tell the validity of their conclusion based upon the old law in England, if that actually makes sense. But that's what they said. And they said that based on that, the only people that can benefit from an injunction, you can't do an injunction for the whole country. All you can do is do an injunction that affects the parties to the dispute. Now, for example, any of you involved in GTII, as a plaintiff, there's about 250 plaintiffs, I think, in that action. Theoretically, all those, if we were talking about, applying that ruling, that set of facts to this ruling, perhaps 250 people would have the right. But in this case, there was there are a few individuals. So what does that do? That means that everybody else, and there's an exception, it's going to be a big exception, everybody else who wants to contest something that, might cause your family member to be, kicked out of the country, would have to file an individual lawsuit. That's the premise of it. Because if you're not a party, you couldn't benefit from an injunction. So that's true, except the court left as two things. One, they sent it back to the lower court to say, kind of craft an injunction that works. and perhaps that will solve the problem. And we'll see, because it could be that the injunction goes back. But there's a big exception, and I think there were a bunch of lawsuits that were filed the day after. Class actions are excluded. And what am I thinking on this is, what's going to happen is all these constitutional challenges to immigration actions, and probably all kinds of other actions, are just going to fund the class action lawyers. Because what will happen is class action lawyers will file actions on these broad topics. They'll get injunctions, and then they will go out and seek class members, and they could accumulate class members. And the court was very specific that class actions were exempted. And that doesn't mean you have to prevail in a class action. That means you have to be in a class action where injunction has been granted. And sometimes those class actions can take years to resolve. So that is a big donut in the Supreme Court's decision. So even though you can't get a universal injunction, you can if you're part of a class action. So I expect, as a result, that the business of class action lawyers is going to increase. I think they're going to be soliciting clients all over the country. Perhaps it will decrease. Yeah, I'm sure it will ultimately decrease. Well, I'm not sure, because it's not like there's billions of these universal injunctions that are being issued. They're not. I think I heard like a number of perhaps 60, something like that, during the current administration, 60 or so. But all those probably could be taken up by class action lawsuits. So I don't know really if this is a big victory as it's being asserted, because I really think it can be circumvented very easily, and I think it will be. The fact that there were a bunch of lawsuits filed the day after, class action lawsuits, suggests to me that the attorneys in this field were already thinking about it. So class actions is an exemption. I think they'll find other ways around it, but to some people, they will not have the opportunity to get relief at all. They will be stuck. They won't get notice of a class action. They won't understand a class action. Maybe they'll be kicked out of the country beforehand, and they won't have a chance to get any kind of remedy. And anyway, that was a discussion. So the Supreme Court has spent a bunch of time kind of figuring out is really an equitable, because that's the issue. Equity is, again, I described it. One is like law, money damages. An action in equity is more like either injunction, declaratory relief, but it's something special, not your typical action. So that's the ruling of the court. So it'll be interesting to see what the ultimate injunction is. And more than that, obviously, it'll be interesting to see what the ruling is on the birthright issue, which is the major issue, obviously, that's sought. I think the ruling does obviously provide additional strength to the executive branch, because it puts the burden on anybody challenging it as opposed to on the executive branch. And not all actions are going to be challenged. So I think it does strengthen the executive branch. And that's it. So basic summary, it limits injunctions to only those parties involved. But if a class action is filed, then it can be basically a universal injunction. That's kind of the ultimate ruling. I saw a couple questions about MMTLP and finger, whatever. I'm looking at MKC, by the way. MKC. MMTLP. There's a whole boatload of them. And I'm going to do somebody sent me something today about, the delay in the CAT system and the basis of that. I'm going to do a video on it, but the CAT system was designed hopefully to track the trades to help us, but it doesn't happen. There's parties that are seeking a delay in that, and there's no really good reason. And again, I'm not a big fan to date of the our current leader, Mr. Adkins of the SEC. Does not seem to be. Maybe he just changed his name to Gensler, give himself some cover. But to this point in time, I have not been impressed by his actions. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Nothing big, just to kind of give you an idea about that Supreme Court ruling, and wait to see what the ultimate ruling, because that's really the important ruling, I'm not going to speculate as to what the ruling is, but the existing law is the existing law, and we'll see the change. Anyway, thank you all for joining me. If you have questions, comments about this, or statements or jokes, feel free. I will see you soon. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day